Blending colors can be super tricky and very overwhelming. When I first started drawing, I had a very small selection of colors that I trusted myself with. Now that I've gained more confidence, here are some tricks that you can use to blend these two different types of colors. You might be asking yourself, what are warm and cool tones? Cool tones are blues, greens, and purples. They help to cool down your drawing. Warm tones are reds, yellows, and orange. These colors are great to make your portrait look a little bit more alive. Warm tones can be warm grays like this one here, or they could be a little bit darker, such as this gray-brown here. Warm colors are fantastic for making your portrait look more alive. Most live animals do have a blush tone to them, so of course you want to be adding these colors. And they don't apply just to brown fur. You can also use it in blonde fur here, such as using this flesh tone, as well as adding other colors on top of it, such as this beautiful ivory color. These two colors together can create a really gorgeous golden effect. Since this is more of a blonde fur, you do want to add a little bit more yellow just to warm it up some more. Believe it or not, I actually used about 10 to 20 color pencils in this one single portrait. It is super important to make sure you're using a variety of colors to blend together so that it looks more realistic and has a good sense of depth. Right here, I'm using a warm gray to create a little bit more shading so that you can actually see that there are little pieces of fur standing out. I will say I had quite a lot of fun drawing this little bit of crazy hair. Once you have many layers built up, you can actually use a lighter color to create a burnish over the top, which helps to blend all of those colors together and it makes it look a little bit more cohesive. Another example of using warm tones, I'm using a warm gray over this area that you would normally think is all just a bunch of warm reds and oranges, but there's actually some grays in there as well. So what I'm doing for the first few layers is applying a little bit of some warm grays as well as some browns and a little bit of red all together so that it has this beautiful blended effect. And of course, don't forget to draw in the same direction as the fur that you see. That's super important for your portrait to look realistic. After the gray and some other colors, you can start to use a little bit more warm tones just so you have that good contrast. It's also very important not to use too much pressure or you will lose all of those colors that you just blended together. Trust me, I have made that mistake way too many times. And the same exact tip, you can actually use a little bit of this ivory to blend over the top of all of the colors, just so that you can still kind of keep the true coloring, but also keep the warm tones in there as well. You can also use this light warm color to create a little bit of some highlighted effects in some of the areas that looks like it just needs to have a little bit of some stray hairs, but not anything too highlighted. Okay, I know white is not necessarily a cool tone, but I like to add it in here because whenever I apply white, it really does cool down the whole drawing. This is a really good color to use to burnish. Next up is a shocking color, green. Yes, you can use green in your portraits. It really doesn't matter what kind of hair either. You can use it on blonde fur, you can use it on brown fur. This is a good color to use for natural reflections in the environment. Another color I love to use is purple, believe it or not. This is a great color to add for cooling down, but also still creating a different type of color in contrast to those warm tones. If you haven't noticed by now, I'm actually showing these same exact examples that you saw using the warm tones. And yes, I was adding some cool tones to it. So I'm using a little bit of this green color that went well with the warm tones. It actually really enhances that golden effect by using a little bit of this green tone. I also use a little bit of this lighter lilac purple to help with the highlighted areas because it kind of gives this really nice shine to those highlights. And it really just does add a nice contrast between the warm tones and the cool tones, going from the highlights to the lowlights. In general, I do like to add the cool tones to the highlight or to the mid-tone areas. For this example here, instead of using a white to burnish, I'm using a light blue because I felt like it needed to have a little bit more of a contrast in the cool tones, because it just had a little bit more warm tones to it. I even used this green in the red a little bit here. It really just added a nice earthy tone to this portrait that I think that it was missing, because sometimes if you use the warm tones too often, it can really come out a little bit too red and too saturated, not looking very natural. If you're wondering what kind of greens I'm using a lot of raw umber colors. And in more of the highlighted areas, I also use a pale blue to create a good sense of contrast. It also helps to blend in a little bit of the tooth of the paper so that that's not showing through nearly as much. Just be careful when you're doing this because you can add a little bit too much blue in there. Here's a quick example as to what I mean by applying cool tones and warm tones to your portrait. Now this is an animal feature of a nose. So as you can see here, I've already drawn using warm pink tones, but you can use a little bit of a purplish gray, which is a cool tone, and that helps to cool it down a little bit in the shaded areas while not detracting the pink tones to it already. So if you just keep going with the warm tones and the shaded areas a little bit more, and then use a variety of different pinks to kind of get it to blend together without losing that sense of depth and not making it too dark. You can also use light blues and whites to lighten it up and blend it all together. Now in the nostrils, I always use black for this part just because they're always just that dark. But as you can see, after the burnishing, it did lighten it up, but it also smooths everything out. Then you can use a warmer tone to start to add a little bit of the shading underneath and above the nostrils there. Then of course there's going to be some texture happening depending on the nose. Usually I use a warm tone for this, but then once again I use that purpley gray to kind of cool it down just a tiny bit. You do also use a little bit of some lighter blues in the highlighted areas. To add even more shading, I don't use straight up black because black can be very cooling. So I use a dark sepia instead and blend that in using a mixture of other warm tones. And even though it may look like it's done, it's not quite done because you can still see the tooth of the paper shining a little bit. Use a lighter blue pencil or just a white to kind of burnish it in. Make sure it's well blended. You can also work your way around the outer part of the nose too, just to get a good outline. Here is another perfect example as to using cool tones and warm tones together. This is an ear. So of course you want to use a little bit of pink in the ear, but then I also use a cooler gray for the little bits of hair on the outer part, which really helps to kind of add that contrast, make it look more lifelike. And then to blend what you have, use a light blue all together, and then you can keep building up those layers. I also use a dark purple, which has a cool tone to it, to really add to the effect of the pink and the warm tones in there. And now it's just a matter of building up all of those layers to the point that you can actually add detail without the tooth of the paper showing through nearly as much. You can finally see that it is starting to darken a little bit. You can use a lighter blue pencil just to kind of get more of the cool tones in, and then use a light ivory to blend for the rest. I really hope that this video was helpful. Please do not forget to like and subscribe. Please go check out my masterclasses that I have on my website. It will be linked below. Learn to draw your own pet. This is an 8-week program where you get to learn to draw all sorts of different animal fur, such as different types of curly fur, straight fur, different colored fur as well, such as brown or black, and different animal features, as well as towards the end you'll get to follow along a full pet portrait tutorial, so at the very end you will get to draw your own pet with confidence.